All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming in to our final Let's Talk About Florida book discussion of the season. So a lot of you have participated with us throughout the entire season. We really appreciate that. We greatly appreciate that. I greatly appreciate how well everybody is now using Zoom. So give yourself a round of applause for learning this brand new technology and really getting with us and letting us get together in a whole different way during times that we couldn't actually get together in person. So really appreciate that. And we're now able to reach a lot more people over a longer distance. So we're hoping to keep this program up and running next year. So please continue to join the book discussions with us and look out for some of those book discussions that we'll have next year. So we may have some participants coming in and out, but everybody is going to be muted as they come into the room. So they'll just kind of slip in quietly here. And I would really like to introduce Pat. So Pat has really gotten through a lot of the book discussions this year. She helped with getting all the books together and really helping out with the moderators and really taking over for this program today. So we're going to really pull it together. There's been a little bit of changes for this program, but we didn't want to postpone this or change it in any ways. We thought that you all would be ready to go. So we want to make sure that you all are also chiming in. Make sure you are able to say what you need to say and chime in when you need to. If you need help with muting or unmuting, if you even just raise your hand in your video, I can see you, so I'll help you out, okay? So I'm gonna pass this along over to Pat. So thank you, Pat.
Thank you. Well, welcome everyone today. Of course, Crystal's just introduced me. I'm Pat Eagles. My co-moderator, Randy Hicks, is not with us today. He was unexpectedly called out of town. So bear with me, participate as you will. And a special thank you to our sponsors very generously who have supported our book discussion this year, and that is Skipper Ferguson Law Firm of Sarasota. So we'll begin with an author background of Gilbert King, a most interesting young man. He is, of course, an American writer and a photographer. He's best known for Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, The Groveland Boys, and The Dawn of a New America, which was published in 2012. It has won him the Pulitzer Prize, and the prize cited this book as a richly detailed chronicle of racial injustice in Florida, in the town of Groveland in 1949, involving 4 Black men falsely accused of rape and drawing a civil rights crusader and eventual Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall, into the legal battle. During his research, King gained access to the FBI's extensive and unredacted files from this case, which had been sealed for over 60 years. He was also granted permission to view the Legal Defense Fund's files for the Groveland case. Lionsgate acquired the film rights in 2013, and it released the film in 2017 with Chadwick Boseman as the featured actor playing the role of Thurgood Marshall. The film is called simply Marshall. I have to highly, highly recommend it to you all. And if you have an opportunity, please watch. Gilbert King's first book was The Execution of Willie Francis, Race, Murder, and the Search for Justice in the Americas. His most recent book is Beneath a Ruthless Sun, a true story of violence, race, and justice lost and found. He's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and is a featured contributor to the Smithsonian's history blog, Past Imperfect. As a photographer, his work has appeared in many magazines, including the international editions of Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Marie Claire, and Cosmo. It is important to note that he tried to sell his first books, including this one we're discussing today, but he failed. And King desperately wanted to keep writing, but with two non-starters behind him, he was certain that no publisher would give him a second chance. And then a year after Devil was written, he got a life-changing text message from a friend. The 2013 Pulitzer Prizes had just been announced, and there on the list, King saw his own name. He didn't even know he'd been nominated. Devil in the Grove, the winner for the general nonfiction, became a New York Times bestseller. When he returned to his school, USF, shortly after winning, he left this university with a degree, an honorary doctor of humane letters. Mr. King had left FSU in his sophomore year to live in New York City, never completing his undergrad work. So he said he always thought of himself as a loser. And when he went back that day and received the award, he felt so proud. He waited to call his mother and give her the good news. The author grew up in Schenectady, New York. He was oblivious, as many people are, of the issues of race. It was years later, once doing the research, that he came to understand the horror that had happened. And it was shocking, he said, that my country had these laws and systems to suppress African Americans. From a storytelling point of view, these underdogs and what they had to do to succeed captured his imagination. The book tells the real story of America in the pre-civil rights era. Placing it chronologically, it occurs 4 years after the war ended. It gives us a thorough background on Thurgood Marshall's early career and his connection to the NAACP, his development of the Legal Aid Fund program, which invalidates the use of the death penalty for rape. It accurately details the crime, the 4 Black men whose lives were instantly changed by false accusations. And this book describes in great detail each player involved in this grievous travesty. King's epitaph for his book is a quote by John J. Chapman from The Negro Problem, written in 1915. There is a law governing the meeting of the races. When a powerful race meets a helpless race, 2 things happen. First, there is a carnival of crime. Cruelty and oppression take place. Some men in each race become hard-hearted, but the reverse also happens thereafter. Goodness and mercy are developed. Certain men become saints and heroes. Now, I would like to move on to some of our questions that were sent out today, and we begin to engage in dialogue. Who do you think is the devil in the grove? Any ideas? Gay.
Hello?
Gay.
Oh,
It has to be the sheriff.
oh,
You think it's the sheriff? Yeah, well, definitely. Bob? You
That's
have an idea?
exactly what I was gonna say, the sheriff and the deputies and the jury and attorney general, governor at times,
Yeah.
the whole clan.
Well, when the author was questioned about the title, most people thought, just as you said, Bob, and gay, but he said, he thought of it in more abstract terms. He thought of the devil as the violence and the hatred that enveloped this situation. So he was thinking in an abstract form. Does this true story fit your vision of what Florida was like in the pre-civil rights era? This is late 40s. Some of you weren't even born yet.
Karen had her hand raised too. Did you have a comment?
Karen?
I was going to say what you actually said. He said, it seemed to me that on a big scale, that the devil was the culture that led to the discrimination based on whatever, based on race, based on whatever it might be. But that, and that in a sense, it's almost more serious than any individual being the devil, because it was so generalized.
Yeah.
Do you think the devil could have been the fact that so many people accepted those atrocities as being normal?
Yeah.
I do.
That's the real
Sure.
shocker. In answer to your question, Pat, about being surprised about the I don't know, the situation in Groveland, having read about the treatment of Blacks, both through the Flagler book and the Bradley Plant book, that wasn't so surprising, because when you saw how they dealt with their own labor forces and the kind of problems they had when they introduced Black laborers into white workforces, or when the expectations of like Tampa was that there could not be any Black servers. They just wouldn't allow that initially.
Mhm.
So the situation in Groveland, I don't think was unique to that part of Florida. I don't think it was unique to the South. And it had been, I think it had expanded since the Civil War.
Yeah, I think so too. And I wasn't aware of this until I was reading through the book a little bit. In the back, they have questions for discussion, but I wasn't quite aware about this. See if I can find it. The citrus industry plays an important role in this story. And with labor such an essential part of production, were you surprised to learn that work or fight laws allowed sheriffs like Willis McCall the ability to arrest men who weren't working? Didn't know that. Were you aware that debt, slavery, and peonage conditions were still in place in the 40s, where arrested men would be made to work in the groves to pay bail or fines? So I think that was kind of standard operating procedure, at least in the groves, but I'm suspecting, as Gay saying, that it perhaps went much further than that into other areas, turpentine production and other such things. Any comments there?
That may not have been unique to the South of having people who were jailed, released, and made to work. I can't cite you anything specific, but I know I grew up in Indiana, in Indianapolis, and there were work crews along the roadways all the time that had to be from the jails, that they weren't from the state prison. So that anomaly of making people work was probably not just a Southern thing.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. And
Okay.
sorry. Yeah, you're right. It's not just a Southern thing, but it did end up happening a lot in the South. And also what was happening, especially with things like the turpentine industry, it started up further north and then slowly moved south as they ran out of trees to tap. So some of it just kind of slowly over time moved further south. But it depends on what industry and what they needed labor for in certain areas. So, but yes, it's not just here.
True. Well, I think of my own early memories in the 40s driving down through the South from Missouri. Oftentimes you would see the chain gangs along the side of the road. And, I think some of those people probably, you're right, were paying fines, bail, whatever, for simple crimes. Maybe they didn't even commit, but that was a way of getting the payback to the government.
And of course, Jim Crow laws as well that were, in operation. So like you said, Gay, they would be let out, they're not in prison necessarily, but you're just walking around the street at the wrong time of day, and now you are in the chain gang. So it happened in, I think, different ways. They found different ways in order to continue to push the agenda, and, against anybody who was Black. So it happened in multiple ways, and there were even laws, again, that they were being forced to uphold in the areas, mostly in the South. So we mostly hear about it in the South, but I think it was mostly prevalent here in the South. But of course, it happened everywhere, but I think a lot of people focus on the South because of our history here. And of course, with the Civil War and things like that, what happened here in the South versus the North. So everybody kind of focuses on that.
Now, was anyone familiar with the Groveland boys before they read the book? Or saw perhaps on the news not too many years ago where the men were finally exonerated? Anyone familiar with their story at all? No. For some reason I was, and even before I saw the movie, and I'm not sure how or why, but maybe because I've been here for such a long period of time, but it's a very hard story to read. I think most of you that I know well enough know what I struggled with just to get through the story. Then when Randy called to tell me he wasn't going to be here, I'm like, Randy, you chose the book. But I think it's important for us to read all aspects of the history of our state, the good, the bad, and the ugly, so we come to an understanding of what we were, what we are today, and hopefully what we will be. Was there anyone in the story that you were familiar with? Just one or two? Certainly Thurgood Marshall.
Thurgood Marshall,
yeah. Anyone know anything about his early days and his start up the ladder to the Supreme Court? I thought that was an interesting part of the book. I really enjoyed reading about his life in New York and all of the good times that he had. And of course, the early days of the NAACP. Anyone have a comment?
I was really interested in I'm trying to look up his name here. Oh, help me, Mr. Moore. I'm pretty sure that's who it was. Harry Moore, isn't he the person who his family ultimately was blown up? Their house was blown up on Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
Only because that's not somebody I knew, but obviously he was very important statewide in the NAACP, and he seemed like such an accomplished person, and I don't know why his story so resonated with me, but it did, as somebody who was a person of conviction.
He was kind of the lone voice in the forest, if you will, wasn't he?
Well, but he became a martyr for the NAACP.
Yes.
I mean, it brought their work to the attention of people nationwide. So, I mean, the man did not die in vain.
No.
It had a positive, however horrible the action was. His death brought something positive out of it.
Yeah.
The book.
I mean, as we've seen that a lot, people who become martyrs do become symbols and energize people. I think there's a quote in it that I think is from Thurgood Marshall that says you can. I think we often say you can't legislate behavior, you can't legislate beliefs, morals, but he says, yes, you can. That if you legislate things that people, in a sense, or some people become involved in thinking about the situation and become more convinced and it does cause change in attitude. So I thought that was interesting, because I think we always say you can't legislate this, you can't legislate that. And his position would be you can.
And I think he's right about that. You know, but before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, there were a lot of things that occurred that today we would just be shocked to see it. Where I live in Kentucky, I started working at the university in 1976. They still had colored and white restrooms in the various service buildings throughout the university. There were colored and white water fountains. I mean, the signs were up there. And I was a girl from the North, and I hadn't been in these buildings until I started working there. I was stunned. Like, are you kidding me? Because I'd always gone to integrated schools. Nobody thought anything of it.
And Gay, so, that was what year, 76, did you say?
76, yes. Kentucky was a little slow to come along and abide fully, I think, by the 64 Civil Rights Act. But public accommodations. People decry the Southern basketball coaches who wouldn't sign Negroes to their teams in the 50s and the 60s. There was a very practical reason for that. They couldn't travel on the same buses, they couldn't travel on planes. They couldn't stay in the hotels. They couldn't be fed. It was a logistical problem if you had blacks and whites on the same team. You know, so I mean, that was despite the passage of the 64 Civil Rights Act. So it took a lot of litigation after that act was passed to more fully implement the measures in the 64 Act. This Groveland case. Go ahead.
I forget the date, but I think that Fort Myers school system was one of the last to integrate in the whole state of Florida. And it was very late.
Yeah, Charlotte County and Charlotte High was one of the first. And then for some reason, even though Fort Myers is not very far away, it was one of the last. But yeah, it's interesting to see that dynamic too. And we had a speaker in February, Dr. Breda, who was from Blanchard House Museum. And she talked about how it was different to live in that one specific place. Not that they didn't have any racism, but it was a little bit different based off of which community that you lived in as well. So everybody's going to have, you know, different perspectives, and every town, every community might have dealt with it in a little bit different, you know, ways. And it's interesting what you say too, Gay, with the black and white fountains and the black and, you know, having it separated. Sometimes that's also an issue with historical groups, historical museums and centers, because they have to figure out, do we keep these things? Do we showcase the history of this, or do we get rid of it completely? So that's actually sometimes debated within museums and history centers as well.
What is the usual outcome of the
There
debate?
are some places that do keep it. So for instance, the in Punta Gorda, the train depot in Punta Gorda, that's a history museum. And so they have kept up the signs. They talk about it. They use it as a talking point, so that people know that this existed there. This was something that existed in history. This is something that existed in time, so that you're not wiping it away completely, so that people know what was happening in that time. But there are some that take it away because they feel that it's time to move on from that point of view. So it depends. Again, it depends where you are. It depends what the community wants as well.
Yeah.
Pat, I think you said, and I know I read in some of the reviews, that people who grew up in Florida, of which I think Randy made this same comment, that he grew up in the Tampa area and obviously had courses in Florida history and all that just in the regular educational system. And yet none of this was ever part of the story. Which, so it tells you that a lot of things in history aren't well documented just in basic history courses, or aren't included in basic history courses. I mean,
Yeah.
perhaps not just in Florida, maybe in other histories as well.
Mhm.
Well, that just sort of proves the shame that the school board is feeling, or that particular school board is feeling, to push it under the rug as opposed to exposing it and talking about it. I mean, I have to say, after reading this book, I'm glad I'm not a native of Florida. Like, geez whiz. but then my family got to this country so late that we weren't involved in the Civil War. But it's just shameful what happened there, and what happened throughout the state and the South predominantly.
Yeah. But, you know, I've talked with different people about this over the times. Karen and I have had many a conversation. As hard as we work to create a level playing field, I really believe that it will be a lifetime project, because man's very nature, human being nature, is to separate for one reason or another. And just on a personal story, quickly, in the 80s, we lived in Atlanta, Georgia, and my Catholic prayer community was invited to Cummings, Georgia, and Forsyth County. And I'm sure you all have heard or read about Forsyth. Anyway, not too different than Groveland. But now we're in the 80s. Okay, so our group boards a bus and down we go to Cummings. And we are in the middle of singing and praising God. And we hear a commotion outside, and we all go to the door of the church and throw it open. And there's a burning cross in the front lawn of that church. And we're looking now at 1983, 1984, somewhere in there. So the clock is still in operation today. I'm not sure, but you know, these things exist. It's not just from long, long ago. It's, you know, it is part of the culture, as much as we'd like to say it isn't and push it aside. It's very real. It was one of the most horrible things I had ever seen, actually, because it just radiated hatred. So, and that's a county that's had all types of problems. If you remember back when Oprah Winfrey took her whole show there because something had happened. I don't know if they didn't allow her programming to be viewed or some awful thing. And so she brought the whole show there for a week and did a whole series of interviews with different government officials and townspeople. But, you know, that was in the 90s. So, you know, these are issues that we're still not quite as awful and horrific as the book, but we're still dealing with elements of it. And I think we always will be. I hope never to that level. The book is just so intense and so hard. I felt it was extremely hard to read. One of the critics said, well, it was written in the style of a gripping detective story by a specialist in US Supreme Court history. King presents a complex, comprehensive narrative that moves from police station and courtroom of the South to Harlem and the NAACP headquarters in New York, delineating the countless personalities involved in a strenuous battle for human rights and dignity. And I think that's so true. It is a gripping book, but it's very hard to read. And it's true. It's not a novel, it's real. And I think it's very hard. I don't know if anyone else found it difficult read, but I know I did.
It was a difficult read. Did anybody other than myself wonder how Mr. King secured all these quotes that are in the book? You know, so-and-so is talking to such and such about something. I mean, they're full sentences, they're dialogues. Where do historic writers derive that information? Word for word.
I don't know. Now, you know, he did have access to the files.
Yeah.
Some of them came out of there. He also had the ability to go into the NAACP's files on the legal aid, legal defense fund.
Legal Defense Fund.
Yeah. So, you know.
Yeah, Thurgood would not like you to confuse those two entities.
Oh, no, pardon me. But, you know, he had that opportunity. So I'm guessing some of the dialogue might have come from the files, FBI comments, etc.
Okay.
The writer,
Was anybody else?
Excuse me, he interviewed several of the people who were still alive. And he
Ah,
tried again
okay.
and again to interview the woman, Paget,
Uh-huh.
and she declined. And I think at one point he rang her doorbell because he wanted to create something more dimensional than just something he took off of the pages of, you know, the court document. And she declined. When she answered the door, she said, "Let sleeping dogs lie."
Mm.
So,
Mm.
and as far as
when you
Karen,
talk, when you talk about the writing of the book, and I'm just thinking of this now that based on what you just said, he actually does paint each almost location. I mean, you almost feel like you're in the car with them when the
Mhm.
sheriff shoots the two. He's, as a writer, he takes material. And I think he's a dedicated historian. He's not making material up, or he's not trying to write a novel, but he writes in a way that it certainly isn't a textbook. It's,
Right.
I found it very visual. I was, with him in various places, or whether the NAACP offices in New York and what was going on between the various lawyers. I thought was really interesting. The woman who comes down and is sort of I guess,
the
an
spy.
undercover agent.
Mhm.
Yeah.
With a peace pin.
Yeah. You could see her talking to various people. It was, in that sense, I found the writing excellent for this type of book.
Mhm.
oh yeah, I think he's an outstanding writer. But when you read about his early background, it's interesting to me because you don't get any indication of that, you know. And they interviewed some of his professors at the university. He did take some writing classes. Well, not some. He took many writing classes, but he said he was always interested in these types of stories because they held his imagination. They were riveting. And that's what led him into these historic novels. Well, not novels, excuse me, Mr. King. But the Willie Francis book, I'm sure, is quite interesting also. I just looked a little bit of that up before I joined the book discussion this afternoon. But he's tackled some, tough topics. And he's done it well, really well. But, also speaking of writing styles, yeah, it is suspenseful in so many ways. And yes, it's descriptive as he takes us from one place to another. But there's also parts of it that remind me of a Southern Gothic story because the characters are eccentric, fantastic incidents, grotesque happenings, angst-ridden sense of alienation filled with violence and crime. And then you have to realize, oh, wait a minute, this is history. It's not just a novel. This has really happened. And it's awful. So I think he's really very effective writer.
Was anybody else sort of shocked that the state's governors didn't act sooner to try to overturn these convictions?
Yeah, why? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, some of it does go back. There was which one was it who, I want to say earlier, certainly than recently, commuted the sentence of the man who was given the death sentence.
Of Walter Irvin.
Yes, and I forget which governor that was, but it's a while ago.
Uh-huh.
So
Leroy Collins, was it?
it could have been, yeah.
1953, I think.
Yeah, it was Leroy Collins. He was originally given life, a death sentence, and it was commuted to life.
Right.
So that was, I mean, that was pretty quickly after the series of trials that went on. And evidently there are people, family members and other people who have been trying for years to get the exoneration, which didn't come, I think, until, was it just this past January? Like last fall, something happened where
Really?
there was some element that has to do, but the exoneration just in January. So, I mean, these guys are long dead.
Yeah. Well, they were pardoned firstly by the governor. I went before Rick Scott, right? And then, nothing happened. And then our current governor came in and pardoned them almost, I think, in his first few months of office. But then another few years went by, and it was the Lake County Circuit Court judge that brought the exoneration to the forefront and made it happen. And then, yes, Karen, that just occurred about a year or two ago, because the granddaughter of Charles Greenlee, who was the youngest of the four, was there for that particular ceremony. And he died just in 2012. So
Right.
Really had escaped them, hadn't they? I mean, they didn't catch him.
no, he
Am I
did.
remembering that wrong?
No, they did. They caught all of them. And
Okay.
Charles Greenlee was one of the few that survived, the early incarceration. Well, the one man, Ernest Thomas,
Oh,
was,
yeah,
he was shot under a tree 400
Right.
times.
right.
He died
Very
before he was ever brought to court. And then Samuel Shepard was killed by the sheriff, and he
Right.
was handcuffed, as you remember, to Walter Irwin.
Irvin. Mhm.
And Irwin survived, and Shepard died in the jail.
Greenlee is the one who did not get the death penalty. He
Right.
got life in
They
prison.
gave him mercy.
Right, and then eventually he was released on, through
Good
some
behavior. I think it was
Right.
good behavior.
good behavior,
Yeah.
and so, and anyway, moved to Nashville or somewhere and created quite a normal, good life for himself. But as you say, he died, well, years before he was ever pardoned or exonerated.
Yeah.
And I was interested to know that those things are all different.
Yeah.
They're obviously
Mhm.
legal terms,
Mhm.
and it's important that you exonerate it,
Mhm.
not just pardon. I can't say I totally understand why, but
It's like a not guilty verdict,
okay.
exonerated. Pardon assumes you have committed the crime, but the rest of your
Gotcha.
sentence need not be, carried out. Thurgood Marshall, he may have set a record for the number of cases that he actually
Wow.
tried before the Supreme Court. I think the number that was in the book was 32 cases. That's an enormous amount of cases to argue before the Supreme Court. And in a way, the Supreme Court and its rulings, they led our country down a pathway that it didn't seem like our congressmen were willing to take us quite as fast. I mean, nobody was legislating integrated schools until after Brown versus Board of Education was decided. It was the court that led the country down that pathway, not our legislators, which is a interesting, to me, commentary on the three branches of government. Who shall lead here? And it was the court that led, which for the legal profession, that's sort of a plum, except most of the congressmen are also lawyers. So I don't know what that says about us lawyers.
Anyone have anything else they'd like to add into this conversation? Bob, what are your thoughts this afternoon upon reading the book?
Well, it's a great book. I think it should be like mandatory reading in like middle school, or everybody should read this book. It was fantastic. And interesting, I looked up some information and I noticed that as far as documented lynchings, they occurred from about the 1880s documented all the way up till 1968, which I hadn't realized that. And regarding colored versus colored only outhouses and whites, I saw those when I was traveling down in the Mississippi area back in the 70s, mid 70s.
Mhm.
I thought it was a great book. Great book. Of course, the individuals, Thurgood Marshall used our Constitution to get these people to move forward. I mean, they weren't able to speak. They had the Bill of Rights was crushed. I mean, they didn't have freedom of speech. Searches and seizures. They went into their houses and they had they didn't have an impartial jury, and of course they were beaten and shot and beaten with a rubber hose. It was really a sad situation, but he did use the Constitution to help them to further civil rights of them. So I thought that was, he risked his life. He risked the life of all his other councilmen too, not just him. Several times he could have been lynched.
Mhm.
To drive out, but then at one point they were all ready to lynch him. That one early part of the book.
Yeah.
So it was, I thought it was a great book and people should read that.
I agree with you. He risked his life. That totally dedicated.
Yes.
Jim,
Did
what
you
about
also
you?
notice there were never any women selected for any jury? I don't think their names were even in the jury pool.
Hmm.
Because at that time, I suspect they weren't allowed to be into the jury pool.
Interesting.
Mhm.
You think it's because the crime was rape and
No.
that, no, okay.
Mm-mm.
I was gonna say that
I don't think
maybe
they were in the pool at all.
for anything.
Right. Remember, this was in the 40s. That women barely had gained the right to vote at the end of 1919 or thereabouts, and I suspect that hadn't made its way to Florida, but I don't know that. I'm just speculating on that. But they might have been drawing names for the jury pool from property owners, and probably at that time most property was held in the name of men. That's a guess on my part, from which they would be drawing their jury pools.
Hmm.
You know, what is still going on in this country that it doesn't relate directly to this book, but the oppression that the Blacks have felt since the Civil War, and things are getting better, is still being visited upon Native Americans.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you go west, it's like two different societies, very different societies. I mean, I think Native Americans are probably being treated worse than Mexicans by their own countrymen.
Yeah.
So it's man's capacity for hatred is unbelievable to me. And that's what it is.
I know, I agree with you 100% on that score. I want to hear from Jim sitting over there in your chair. What are your thoughts on this book? What do you think?
Have to unmute.
Unmute, Jim.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I have to admit, Bob, you put me to shame because I have not read the book. But I'd be glad to give you a report later. Rosemary did read part of it. I just did not have an opportunity to read it. But as I listened to the comments, and as you know, I have devoted the last 6 years of my life to the history of this area. I am intrigued by the fact that as to what we have as an oasis of relative freedom for Blacks, surrounded by other regions that can boast of discrimination. And I say that in the most negative sense. What I'm talking about, and Crystal, you might comment on this, is the community of Punta Gorda. I am intrigued by how different the treatment of Blacks was part of their history, very different than many of the other surrounding communities. As I said, in a relative sense, for Black people, it was kind of an oasis of liberty as compared now, and be careful on this, as compared to many of the surrounding communities, and I would include Boca Grande on that. Am I not right, Crystal?
Yeah, and that's a little bit of what Dr. Burita was talking about in her presentation. And for those who couldn't come to that presentation in person, it is available on our website, so you can view it there. It's not that there was no racism. There was definitely racism over time in this area. It's just that it wasn't as violent necessarily in certain respects. We definitely had turpentine industry here, so that was a very violent aspect. There were tons of turpentine camps basically along 776 area. And like I said, that kind of moved further south and it eventually got to our area because it was coming from, up a little bit north, North Carolina areas, Virginia. And just as they kind of moved through the pine tree forest and they ran out of pine tar, they just kept moving further south. And so, yes, there are lots of little pockets of areas where everybody worked together a little bit better, but we're not completely clean. Our slate isn't completely clean in this area, but yes, especially in smaller communities sometimes where people had to work together to survive. And over time, it's true for, not just the Black community and white community working together, but also some of the natives and Cuban fishermen. So this was a little bit of a hodgepodge of a situation here because they had to work together in order to make money in the industries that they were working for. They had to work together to fish. They had to work together to make sure they had their boats running and in working order. They worked together on the railroad, but obviously, it was most of the businesses were owned by whites. So it's a little bit more rare. Yes, in Punta Gorda, we did hear about George Brown, and George Brown is very prominent in the Punta Gorda area, and he owned a business and he was fair in how he paid his workers, Black or white. But he also was not allowed to go into the courthouse that he sold the land for Punta Gorda to build. So it's better than having tons of lynchings, yes, but it wasn't perfect here either. We did not have as many lynchings and things like that in this area, but there was the Ku Klux Klan in Punta Gorda as well over time. And a lot of people do say that the area worked well, or the community worked a little bit closer together before a lot of the northern residents came in. And then the northern residents came in with more rules and regulations. So you can actually see in newspapers how that changed over time, where, some people may be considered Black citizens, and then after the 1920s and, into the 30s and 40s, they may be, called Negro instead. So it turned into, worse terminology over time, where they were working together a little bit more and a little bit more equal earlier on than later on. So every community has dealt with the history of racism or the current events, current affairs of racism differently. Obviously, what we have here may be very different than anywhere else, and I think that this book helps to bring up what was happening in certain areas, things that may not be talked about, things that counties and, historical societies may not be proud of to say that was happening. We have been able to dig up a lot in our area as well, and we try to promote as much of the true history as it is, as much of the information as we can find. But I know, Jim, even this, sometimes it's harder to even just find Black history to talk about.
That is true. And to give you an example, we have dedicated a portion of the History Center to a focus on Boca, Grande, and the Black experience. And we have really searched for relevant materials to best explain this experience. But it's interesting that certain segments of that history, very difficult to find or discover information that can give us the total picture. Would you not agree, Crystal, with that? Especially with the community that lived east of the railroad tracks. That community, which mainly served the Black community, the Blacks that lived in that area, mainly provided labor for the merchants and for those who along Gilchrist Avenue, for the winter residents. And that community was, I've used the word encourage, put it in quotes, to move out of that area in the late 50s and early 60s. And many of them went down to the south end of the island, Tarpon State. But it is we have ample materials on the Black community at the south end of the island, whether it be Tarpon Pass Estates or the Seaboard Quarters, where the Blacks lived in rented housing provided by Seaboard Railroad. But we have next to nothing, including a photo, although I have discovered a photo of the old church that once existed in the Black community, that existed basically between Palm Avenue, from First Street to about 3rd Street and Palm Avenue to almost the Bayou area. It is next to impossible to find information in that area, and that's what we're lacking. I always want to make a comment. Someone said something about governors. Gay, maybe you said, someone said they were surprised that the governors were not as bold in correcting the injustices. We have to remember, this is true in many states, not only in the South, that governors were political creatures and also products of their environment. I would like to think that those who take positions of leadership are all potential profiles in courage. But that's not the way it is. And for these governors to take what might be politically an unpopular move was not unusual in the history, especially not only in the South, but especially in the South. I personally experienced some of those injustices when I had to leave the Chicago area to go down to Parris Island to serve my first training session in the United States Marine Corps. I had to travel through the Atlanta airport. This would have been in what, Rosemary? 1958. Okay. I had to go to the restroom. I walked into a restroom, it said, and I happened to walk into a restroom that I did not realize was for colored people. And I was very quickly admonished and encouraged to move out quickly. That was an eye opener for me. And other experiences when I traveled down south to go to base camp. I also in college, I don't know if I ever told Rosemary, my wife, about this, so this could be an eye opener. But I took a young lady to one of the college dances, they called the Big Four dances, formal dance. And she was a Black lady from Chicago. And this was in central Illinois. And I don't want to express my thoughts in terms of the looks that, that I received from that Agnos, which leads me to make another comment that as you define the South, you go to places like a northern state like central Illinois. Once you get to this is the past, of course. Once you get to like central Illinois, true of many states, you're basically in the South in terms of lifestyles and cultures. Because, and that was also true, of course, in communities in the northern part. So, and I agree with Gay that the courts led the way for breaking down this very unjust system that occurred. And that was a very bold move. Courts, the Supreme Court, I studied the Supreme Court. I spent a whole summer in a seminar in the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court justices. And we would like to say they are not politically inclined, political animals. Well, that's enough. I guess that's a subject for a future discussion. But,
maybe only the Supreme Court could have led the country toward more tolerance and toward accepting integration because they had a lifetime appointment. The Supremes didn't have to run for office every 2 years, 6 years. So maybe because they had lifetime appointments, they were in the best position to try to lead this country into a different direction.
You're probably correct on that, Gay. But today we look at nominations to the Supreme Court and we talk in terms of liberals or conservatives. So, I'm not convinced that the Supreme Court, at least in today's world, is above the political arena. Because
no, they're very political.
So that move back in the 1950s was a very bold act.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there have been many presidents who have been shocked that their liberal nominee suddenly became conservative or their conservative nominee became liberal. Justice Douglas was considered to be a conservative when he was appointed, and boy, did he change around.
That's correct.
It looked before like Marcy might have had her hand up, or I'm not sure if somebody, Boots or Marcy, there was a little hand icon. And I don't know if they wanted to say something or not, or if they can.
I can say something if you can hear me. I don't know if you can. I did not have my hand up though. I wanted to give that time to if someone else did.
Okay, did anybody else want to interject here? I'm sorry if I missed anybody's hand. I was just so engrossed in this conversation here. And you guys are so good at muting and unmuting. I stopped checking so much on you all. So if anybody else needs help, you can go ahead now and raise your hand and I'll help you out. I think think
It
that's
relates, Crystal, it relates to now today. We have, new legislation in the state of Florida relating as to what should or should not be taught regarding racial relations courts. And that's going, I'm going to be very interested as to how that's going to break down, since being a former educator. You're all familiar with the new legislation, right? Well, it is. It deals with racial. I think the law basically indicates that we should avoid placing blame. Is that not correct? For past injustices on our current constituency or young people.
yeah,
Am I not correct?
yeah, that's some of the situation that's going around now. Critical race theory is the biggest one, I think, that you're talking about, Jim, right now, where some schools are actually opting out and they're not allowed to talk about critical race theories. There are some schools and some school boards where parents are actually allowed to sign their children out of talking about any of this. So that is there's a lot of controversy going on right now. So yes, this book can touch on many different topics, and yes, it relates to past events, but we can kind of use this, we're looking at this example of very violent and overt racism that was happening, where, I mean, they didn't actually commit any crimes at all, but were convicted and had to have these terrible sentences or even their own deaths. So we can kind of look at some of the things that have happened in the past and maybe relate those to some of the things that are happening today as well.
Bob said everyone should read this book, and I'm not in disagreement. It would be interesting if a teacher, especially it would be a high school reading assignment, assigns this as a required reading. That teacher could well be challenged, and it could be litigated, possibly under this new law.
Marcy has her hand up. Go ahead, Marcy.
I guess I just wanted to say that it always and has never stopped ceasing to amaze me that I guess that this is even a question. I understand it is, of course, but where I grew up, again, in Northern Illinois, but in a smaller town right outside of Chicago, there were no Black people, but we were 60% Hispanic because of immigrant workers. They were all my friends, never thought of them any different. I later worked for a sheriff's office as a multi-county task force drug investigator on long-term assignments. I lived with people in some of the poorest and most dangerous neighborhoods in Chicago. And I did that for a year. I lived with them. And I watched people get shot in the street and never another word was spoken about it. I can't even tell you, that was just in the 90s. I know there's a gang war, I understand that, but to have a human life just disappear and it never even documented into history, no obituary, no police report, literally just bagged, tagged, and sent away. And that was the 90s. I go to New Orleans, where my friend lives, and the air is even clearer. It feels so much more, I don't know, I guess equal. Everybody likes everybody else. Everybody else accepts everybody else. There's all different kinds of people. Everybody accepts that. And I mean, even trying to get a historical marker on a cemetery down here. Even with the cemetery off El Jobim, where I did the story a couple of years ago, just to talk to Charlotte County and say, why are there no more markers? Why is there no more information? What can we do to fix this? And they're excited for all of 5 minutes and they forget. And this is all crazy to me. I don't understand it. I still don't understand it. I don't think I'll ever understand it. But these books need to be, as I believe Mr. Egel said, they need to be handed out and thoroughly examined in classrooms. Because my generation, Generation X, we really didn't even think that much about race in anywhere I've ever lived. And now it's like becoming more and more of an issue, or is it? And it just, people need to understand this. They need to have it smacked in their face that this is how it used to be and how it still is in some places. That's all.
I agree. I agree with you. Well, I think we're going to conclude our conversation for today. I thank you all for being here and joining in, and we look forward to seeing you again. We'd like for you to send your suggestions for Florida book titles that we can add to our growing list. And you'll find that list on our website. And please consider moderating a book discussion with us next season. We appreciate your ideas, and we most always appreciate your participation. So I thank you personally, and I thank you for the Historical Society. And that concludes our meeting.
And thanks to Randy for making us read this book.
Yes.
Thank you,
Yes.
Randy.
And please keep a lookout into your emails. If you've participated in a book discussion, we're going to send out a survey. Feel free to send me any information, or you can send information through the info@BocaGrandeHistoricalSociety.com, or we're sending out a survey so that we can figure out what books you'd like to do and how we can keep you all involved in these really great book discussions that we've been having. Even though some of you may not even have read the books, it helps bring up new topics for all of us to discuss. So we really appreciate you being here, and regardless of whether you read the book or not, just to learn a little bit of new topics, new information about something you may not have thought of to look into before. So thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.